Anyway, as her life went on, Teresa strove mightily and with great struggles to create the conditions for what she saw as what would be life-changing prayer, to change conditions both outside herself and most of all to change her heart inside. And finally, after years of dithering, she got the grace and the backbone to do something about it. It was triggered by conversations with some young, like-minded nuns who had also joined the convent of the Incarnation in Avila. So they decided to start something new as a help to the turmoil that the church was going through at the time. This is when the Protestant Reformation was at its height. So they wanted to start something new with the simple aim that since the Lord has so many enemies and so few friends, that these friends at least should be trusty ones. And Teresa was their leader, and she was a natural leader, and she set about this new adventure with a steely determination which was her hallmark right through her life. And she overcame major obstacles along the way, but eventually St Joseph's in Avila came into being in 1562 when Teresa was 47 years of age, which would probably be the equivalent of about 67 today. And so she entered these calm waters, and that journey alone would have been probably enough to make her a saint. But so much more was to come, because she was a chosen vessel and a gift of God to his people. And the second part of her life then began 5 years later. And this part of her life becomes overwhelmingly apostolic, in the sense that she became a teacher of prayer through the new convents and monasteries of friars that she started, and most of all through her writings, in which her genius as a teacher came to the fore. Teresa had this uncanny ability not only to live life to the hilt and experience an intimacy with God granted only to a few, but she also had the capacity to articulate her experience in a way that's clear and compelling. She says herself that experiences in prayer is one thing, understanding them is another, and yet another is the ability to speak about these experiences in a coherent way. Not every saint can teach, and not every teacher is a saint. But Teresa is both a saint and a consummate teacher, and we're blessed to have her as tutor. If you think for a while of the qualities you'd look for in a good teacher, somebody who's a good communicator, using simple but clear language, speaking or writing in an attractive style, making good use of imagery, and when it comes to spiritual matters then somebody with experience, discernment, wisdom and intuition, backing up what they have to say by an echoing lifestyle. And Teresa ticks all these boxes. She echoed the words of the book of Proverbs, I have counsel and sound wisdom, I have insight, I have strength, endowing with wealth those who love me and filling their treasures. She teaches in images rather than in ideas. She inspires confidence because you can see that she knows what she's talking about. She might be distracted all over the place, wordy at times, but she's never a spoofer. She's good company when she writes, as she must have been great company to be with. And you feel that she writes as she would have spoken. In fact, her nuns said that about her. So there's an immediacy in her writing that goes beyond time and space and the particular style of writing at that time in 16th century Spain. Hers is a conversational style. You're almost drawn into dialogue with her, and she sort of anticipates your questions, and she has the reader in mind all the time. Add to this then her abundance of common sense, an unrivaled knowledge of human nature, an ability to make allowances for people, and a gentleness and yet a firmness that are necessary in any wise guide, and of course her trademark sense of humour, which always enabled her to keep perspective on things, and nobody was spared. St John of the Cross was in the parlour of one of her convents one day, and the nuns, as they do, were plying him with questions, and at one stage Teresa remarked, "We're grateful to the Reverend Father for having explained so well what we didn't ask." So let's look then at the adventure that prayer was for Teresa. First, she says, there are a few requirements, and this is where prayer dovetails with life, and she's speaking from bitter experience here. She's asking us first to to have love in our lives towards all. Then detachment from a worldly kind of existence and humility at all times. So love, detachment, humility, she's hammering these home the whole time. Not that we have to wait to have them all in perfect measure before beginning to pray, but we do need to be trying to make them part of our lives. Otherwise, prayer becomes the struggle that it was for Teresa for many years, because prayer and an unchristian way of life don't go well together, rather like God and mammon. So on to prayer then. She starts with what she calls vocal prayer, which is where we all start, in the fixed prayers that we learned at our mother's knee maybe, and that are a link on to God for us. And in Teresa's time, vocal prayer was about the only place that people were allowed to start or indeed finish either. The Spanish Inquisition, as you know, was in full flow, and many books about prayer were banned as being too adventurous in going beyond a vocal prayer. And Teresa was very clever here in her writings. When she came to write The Way of Perfection, she wrote it ostensibly as a commentary on the Our Father, but she wove a whole teaching on prayer into it. And the inquisitors couldn't very well ban it, because it was about the Our Father. And of course the coup de grace then was when Teresa writes that the Our Father can lead one to the heights of contemplation, to keep you from thinking that little is gained through a perfect recitation of vocal prayer. I tell you that it's very possible that while you are reciting the Our Father or some other vocal prayer, the Lord may raise you to perfect contemplation. So Teresa was comfortable with vocal prayer, and she recommended it to her sisters, as long as it didn't become a mechanical recitation of prayers with little reference to the friend to whom we're praying, and recognizing the importance of thinking of what we're saying, lest these prayers become routine. Is it the king in Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet? My words fly up, my thoughts remain below. Words without thoughts never to heaven go. Most of the books that people were allowed to read at that time were about vocal prayer, even though Teresa had already got great help from a book which wasn't as yet banned, would be later, the Third Spiritual Alphabet, which spoke about a more advanced form of prayer which led from meditation to a quietness in prayer. Teresa, you see, had already been having experiences of prayer that were touching on something deeper, and she was convinced of the authenticity of these experiences, but true to form, she always ran them by her confessors, and not all of them were as knowledgeable as she was. And for a long time they told her to stick to her prayers, her vocal prayers. So this held her back almost as much as the ambivalence of her lifestyle, and she's always lamenting in her writings the harm that unlearned spiritual directors can do. Her battle cry was, give me a learned man ahead of a holy man. So a part of the natural development of prayer for Teresa, which we take, of course, so much for granted nowadays, was to go beyond fixed prayers and talk to God in our own way, feeling at home with him, talking things over with him, bringing him into our life as we go along, what we call mental prayer, and Teresa uses the term herself, and this form of prayer is perfectly in line with her well-known definition of prayer as being the heart-to-heart conversation with someone, God, that we know loves us. She had great devotion to the Passion of Jesus and recommended meditation on the Passion to her nuns as a very good way to stir up conversation with the Lord and to ignite love in the heart. Her favourite Passion scene was the scourging at the pillar, as she used to call it, Jesus bound to the column, because she considered that that's what was when he was most alone with no friends around. And she says to her nuns, think of the pains that he bore there, why he bore them, and with what love he suffered them. We should remain by his side with our minds hushed in silence and occupy ourselves in looking upon him who's looking at us, keep him company, talk with him, pray to him, humble ourselves before him, and remember that he never deserved to be there. So this is a different kind of prayer. It goes deeper than vocal prayer. It's more authentic because it wells up spontaneously out of our life experience and from our hearts. And it's a prayer which calls for periods of silence too, resting in the Lord with the focus on him, sometimes pictured as being present within our deepest being. And this was a big breakthrough for Teresa, coming to that realization that she didn't have to go outside of herself to find God. Oddly enough, she says she found it hard to use her imagination in prayer. We think she has a great imagination reading her writings, but she said she found it difficult in prayer to use her imagination or to picture a scene from the gospel and, put herself among the crowds when Jesus was speaking. And that was the recommended way of doing things in the books that were allowed at the time. But thinking of Jesus within her was a lot easier for Teresa. And she found great help again in St Augustine, whom she quotes in the latter stages of the way of perfection. Consider what St Augustine says, that he sought God in many places, but found him ultimately within himself. And she calls this the prayer of recollection. She didn't invent that term, she inherited it, and she went along with it. She says this prayer is called the prayer of recollection because the soul collects its faculties together and enters within itself to be with its God. For centered within itself, it can think about the Passion and not tire the mind by going to look for him on Mount Calvary or in the garden or at the pillar, the scourging at the pillar. And she articulates this beautifully here and there in chapters 26 and 28 of The Way of Perfection. Become aware of how close God is to you, lovingly, humbly teaching you. Stay with so good a friend for as long as you can before you leave him. You will never be able to send him away if you become accustomed to having him at your side. If he sees that you love him to be there and are always trying to please him, he'll never fail you, but will help you in all your trials, and you'll have him everywhere. He's so near that he will hear us however quietly we speak. We've only to find a place where we can be alone and look upon him present within us. There's no need to feel strange in the presence of so kind a guest. We talk to him very humbly, as we should to a friend. We ask him for things as from a friend. We tell him our troubles, and we beg him to put them right. So there are hints here of what Blessed Elizabeth of the Trinity was later to describe. It seems to me that I found my heaven on earth because heaven is God and God is in my soul. Teresa is all for this, and she recommends it to her nuns. Those who by such a method can enclose themselves within this little heaven of the soul, where the Maker of heaven and earth is present, should believe that they're following an excellent path. And even though it isn't aware of this at the beginning, the soul should get used to this recollection. I only ask you that you try this method, because it will lead you to a gradual increase of self-control and an end to vain wandering from the right path. So always the touchstone for Teresa is, how are you living your life? Love, detachment, humility. And for her, the authenticity of all prayer can only be shown in the practice of virtue and the cut and thrust of daily life. He used to say about the nuns, or to the nuns, the holier they are, the more sociable they'll be with their sisters. So this is an accessible form of prayer, she says, that the nuns can bring about if they're faithful to their time of prayer, and gradually then God will bring them to something quieter and deeper that is his gift, and that's the prayer of quiet, which Teresa describes in chapters 30 and 31 of The Way of Perfection. This now is the beginning of contemplation, where meditation is no longer necessary or even possible, and God wants us to be absorbed quietly in him, to rest in him without words and thoughts, to, as they say, relax into the reality of being loved by God, immersing ourselves in the divine being, anchoring ourselves in the rock of God's power, drinking from the wellspring of God's infinity, you might say plugging into the divine energy, a kind of a spiritual sunbathing where we passively absorb the rays of God's love.